אוקיי, בוקר טוב לכולם. לטובת אורחנו מחול, אז אני אומרת good morning everybody. Thank you for being here this morning. It is not trivial to be in Jerusalem at 9 o'clock in the morning given the traffic jams in our country. So thank you very much. Our participants and guests, the importance and necessity of sound assessment and evaluation is widely agreed upon. However, there is no consensus as to what means are most effective for ensuring the soundness of assessment and evaluation. Therefore, one of the key questions in this regard is how assessment policy can be efficiently implemented in order to advance students' performance and achievement. Ms. Deborah Nusche, who is a policy analyst in the Education and Training Policy Division of OECD Education Directorate, will address this question and will be sharing with us a finding from an international comparative study with the title Synergies for Better Learning, an international perspective on evaluation and assessment in school education. With that, I ask that you give your full attention to Ms. Nusche and help me welcoming her to the stage. Ms. Nusche.
Good morning. Thank you. Well, I would like to thank very much the organizers and in particular Michal Beller for the kind invitation to the OECD to come to Israel and to be part of this conference. I'm very happy to be here. In this presentation, I would like to share some of the key messages that we have from a 4-year project that we conducted at the OECD on approaches to evaluation and assessment in schooling. Israel was an active participant in this project, and Israel shared some information, qualitative information on the national approaches to evaluation and assessment here. And Michal also came to our final conference in Oslo last year and shared with us some information on the very sophisticated approaches that you have to student assessment here in Israel. So it's really a pleasure to be here and in a way return the favor and feed back some of our international findings back to Israel. At the OECD, as you probably know, we do a lot of work on education, and what the OECD is probably best known for is the international indicators and statistics, but we also have a stream of our work that does more qualitative work where we do actually analysis of national policies, and that's the part of OECD work that I'm involved in. Evaluation and assessment is a very high priority of our work in recent years. And actually every 2 years we ask our OECD member countries to rank different policy topics by order of priority. And it turned out that last time that we asked them in 2009 when we engaged in this project, that evaluation and assessment was the #1 priority that OECD countries wanted us to focus on. So really around the world there's a lot of interest in this topic. And there are a number of factors that are contributing to the growing attention to evaluation and assessment in schooling around the world. And I think one very important factor is the increasing amount of research that actually points to evaluation and assessment as a key factor in providing information that can give feedback to learners, that can give professional feedback to teachers and to school leaders, and thereby can lead to improvement in teaching and learning. So there's really quite a lot of evidence, as we already heard yesterday in a number of presentations, on evaluation and assessment being a very powerful tool, a very powerful educational intervention that can contribute to improving education systems. So that has contributed to also at the policy level having greater attention to this topic. The policy contexts across OECD countries are of course also contributing to the attention to evaluation and assessment. Across OECD countries there's been a trend over the 1990s and the 2000s towards greater decentralization and school autonomy. And this is what is illustrated in this graph here, which shows the percentage of decisions taken in school systems at the school level, that's the dark blue part, and at the local level. And we see that in about 2/3 of OECD countries, more than half of the decisions are now taken at the school or at the local level. And as policymakers are giving more responsibility for decision making to schools, this typically comes along with also greater demands for accountability and greater interest in accountability information from schools. So there's been also a drive towards greater central standards and central examinations and assessments, also external evaluations of schools and so on. Linked to that, we also have greater societal demands for information on school quality. In most OECD societies, we now have more educated parents and communities who are interested in knowing about the quality of individual schools and knowing about the equity that the school system is achieving. And in the context of the financial crisis, there's also greater interest in the efficiency of school systems and in knowing how the money that is invested in education is actually used and what types of outcomes schools are achieving. And the media in many countries also plays a role, not always a constructive role, in driving the demand for transparency and in driving the demand for greater information on individual schools and on the outcomes that schools achieve. So again, that fuels greater interest in evaluation. And also, as we heard yesterday, there have been a lot of technological developments that allow for more sophisticated approaches to evaluation and assessment. And there's been a great many wonderful tools that have been developed that allow for more individualized assessment or broader assessment of performances that are closer to what we really want students to know in real life. So again, this has generated more interest in evaluation and assessment around the world. So these are just a few factors that contribute to the interest in this topic. And it's in this context that OECD countries have decided in 2009 to embark on a project of peer learning and of stock taking to really understand what are different countries doing in these areas and what are the things that countries can learn from each other. So I will now speak a little bit about the project that we conducted and the international report that we published, and give you some information about the participation of countries in the analytical framework that we used for this review. The purpose of the OECD study was to explore how evaluation and assessment can be used to improve the quality, equity, and efficiency of school education. And the focus was on national approaches to evaluation and assessment. So the focus here is not on the international assessments like PISA and so on, which are of course part of national frameworks, but what we were really interested in is what happened in different countries, what were the policy frameworks in different countries to evaluation and assessment. And the focus is on primary and secondary education. And I think what is the most distinctive feature of this study that we conducted is its attempt to have a comprehensive approach to this topic. So the review looks at the various components of evaluation and assessment at the level of the student, the teacher, the school, and the education system. And that's what is graphically depicted here. So the idea of the project is to look at the assessment of students in the classroom and externally, at the appraisal of teachers and of school leaders as professionals. It also looks at the evaluation of schools as organizations and the evaluation of school systems as a whole. And the focus of the study is very much, we look at each of these components in some depth, but the focus really is on seeing how do they actually play together to form coherent frameworks for evaluation and assessment, how are countries trying to make those elements coherent. And countries decided that the main focus of the study should not be on evaluation and assessment as an end in itself or just as a tool, but really to see how can this serve teachers and school leaders to actually improve the teaching and learning process. So this would be the main focus. We conducted this study in 3 phases, or we had 3 streams of analysis. One aspect was the analytical phase, where we did quite a lot of desk-based research. We conducted 11 literature reviews on distinct topics related to evaluation and assessment. So there's one on formative assessment, one on summative assessment, one on the alignment between standards and assessment, one on school evaluation. Some of them we did ourselves. We had a team of 3 analysts at OECD, and some of them we commissioned to outside experts. We also received 26 country background reports from participating countries. So these are quite in-depth reports where countries describe their national frameworks and approaches to evaluation and assessment. And we have from all our 29 participating education systems country questionnaire responses where they gave us some comparative information on their evaluation and assessment systems. We also conducted a country review phase where volunteer countries asked the OECD to form an expert team of 4 people who would actually come to the country, to the concerned country, for 10 days and try to go a bit beyond what's in the papers, try to look beyond the documents. And actually what we do during these country reviews is conducting interviews with all those who have a stake in the education system, so starting with the education minister and the main central agencies, but we also speak to the teacher unions, the parents' organizations, the students' representatives, and we would travel to 3 or 4 different regions of the country, speak to local authorities, and visit a number of schools, which of course is not representative, but it gives a flavor of different types of schools. So we try to visit small and large schools, rural and urban schools, vocational and mainstream and general program schools. So the idea is to get an idea of talking to teachers and students and school leaders on the ground, which also I think, as we saw yesterday with the school leader here, really gives a different perspective on these issues. And the outcome of those country reviews is an individual report for the country with an analysis of what, from the international knowledge that we have, of what we consider strengths and what we consider challenges in the concerned country. And the final stream of this project was what we call the synthesis phase, where we try to make sense of all of this information and to bring it together in a final comparative report. I have an example here. This is the report, so it's very massive. In our own self-assessment, we found we have to be more succinct next time. But the idea was really to try and cover all of these aspects of evaluation and assessment systems. I leave a copy here for those who are interested to flip through. It's also it's also available online, so you can read it online for free. And for those who are really interested, please feel free to write me an email and I can send you a copy as well. Just very briefly about the participation of countries. So we had 15 excuse me. We had 15 countries participating in the analytical strand of this project, and Israel is one of them. All of these countries provided us with responses to our comparative data tables. And some of these countries also provided us with a country background report where we provided guidelines from the OECD to have a common structure for these background reports. They're about 150 pages long and really give a very good description. And it's quite fascinating to see across countries how different the national frameworks for evaluation and assessment are. And on the right-hand side on the column, we see the countries that participated in the country review strand. So we had 14 country reviews that took place between 2010 and 2013. In terms of participation, you can see we have quite a lot of European countries, but we also had some non-European countries, including Canada, Mexico, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Korea. So that gave us a bit more of a more international perspective. And to the very right, you see again the evidence base for the review. So it included reviews of research, international indicators, the country reports, and our own country review studies. The analytical approach I've already mentioned a little bit. So we look at the 4 key components of evaluation and assessment frameworks, including different types of student assessment, appraisal of teachers and school principals, school evaluation, and school system evaluation. And then we have a number of key questions that cut across all of those components, which could be phrased as I did on the right-hand side here. The first question is around purposes and use of results. So why do countries evaluate? What do they want to achieve? What is the use of results? And what are ways to actually avoid misuse of results? The second question would be around scope and procedures. So what is valued learning? What is it that we want to measure and evaluate? And what are the right instruments to do so? And the final question is around who is involved. So this is about striking the right balance between central and local approaches to evaluation and assessment, and also building capacity at all levels to do this effectively. So what I would like to do in the rest of the presentation would, first of all, to go through each of the components and give you some flavor of the key trends and developments regarding each of those main components. And then I will try and address those cross-cutting questions that I mentioned. So starting with student assessment, what are some of the trends that we see? As I mentioned earlier, there has been a lot of research evidence on the benefits of formative assessment and on using assessment for learning. So what we found is that increasingly at the policy level this is being recognized. So at least in the rhetoric of most of the participating countries, there are now central policy frameworks for formative assessment in place. And this is what we see on this graph. So we see the existence of central policy frameworks for formative assessment at the primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary level. We see it's slightly more common to have those at primary and lower secondary education than at the upper secondary level. And there's a specific focus on formative assessment typically in the earlier years of education. At the same time, summative assessment and reporting remain, of course, important across all countries, especially at key stages of schooling. And we had, of our participating 29 systems, 21 had policy frameworks for internal summative assessment in place. And we see on this graph which ones do have such frameworks. So what this means is basically that there's a prescription on the way that assessment should be implemented by school, for example, the number of assessments or subject-specific prescriptions. And in Israel, I believe in the upper secondary level, it's the part of the matriculation examination that would be internal, and there would be a prescription for that. Overall, what we see regarding this internal assessment, formative and summative, in countries is that pretty much all countries reported that the main person responsible for assessment remains the teacher, and that's very important. In most countries, this is conceptualized as an important aspect of teacher professionalism, that they would design and implement their own assessments, and that they would be the ones who also interpret the outcomes of the assessment and use it for their teaching. So it is an important aspect. In some of the European countries, it was really the main type of assessment for many, many years, was really the teacher, him or herself, being in charge of this. However, across many countries, there was concern also about the extent to which this would be comparable, the teacher-based assessment. And in quite a few countries, there was concern about the lack of a shared understanding of quality criteria. So what constitute adequate performance, what is excellent performance? So to actually have the criteria for performance was often a challenge. And we found in some countries, especially in the Nordic countries in Europe, that what would be evaluated as excellent work in one school could be evaluated as not so good work in another school. So some concern about that, and a general trend towards introducing not only central standards, but also central examinations and assessments across OECD countries. So of the 37 systems for which we have information on that, 26 countries had, or education systems, had central standardized examinations in place. We see in this graph that this is most common at the upper secondary level, of course, where we really need to certify performance of students for further trajectory. It's also quite common at the lower secondary level. We had it in 14 of the 37 systems, and it's not very common at the primary level, where the focus is not so much on having examinations with an impact on the students' further trajectory. And finally, we also see a lot of development of standardized central assessments with no stakes for students. So these would be used either to provide feedback, formative feedback to teachers and students, or for system monitoring, but it wouldn't have a civil impact on students' further progression. And we see that this is very common across countries, especially at the primary and lower secondary level, to have such monitoring assessments. What are some of the main issues that came up related to student assessment? One common concern across countries was that assessment formats tended to remain more traditional than curriculum goals. So across countries, there's a focus on broader curriculum goals, on 21st century skills, on learning in many aspects, developing creativity, entrepreneurship, and so on. But we don't see that focus so much in assessments. And across countries, most assessments remain quite focused on recalling knowledge, on basic skills. So that was the main focus in what is in the national policy framework. There's of course a lot of development of innovative tools, but we were looking at what happens nationally. There's also concern about resolving tensions between formative and summative assessment, and we see especially in countries where there are high stakes external assessments that there's a lot of focus on those assessments, and that there's a risk that this squeezes out time and attention to more formative approaches to assessment. Also, we saw quite a limited focus on developing students' own assessment competencies, and there's a lot of research showing the importance of students not only being active participants in their assessment, but really being the main connector between assessment and future learning. It's the students themselves that need to take steps and change their learning. But across countries, often they were really seen as the subject of assessment rather than active participants in this process. There were also concerns about teacher and school leaders' preparation for assessment, and that's again around this topic of striking the balance between internal and external assessment and making sure that on the one hand teachers had sufficient tools, sufficient external tools that they could use and that would give them an idea of the external expectations and of national expectations of what students should achieve. And on the other hand, teachers' own capacity to complement this with assessments that are useful within their own teaching and that they can use on a daily basis within the lessons. And of course, an important aspect is also about using results to report to parents and to make sure that resources, not only in school but also at home, are focused on achieving valued learning goals. Coming to the second component of frameworks, which is the teacher appraisal. This is a very interesting component, and it's probably the one where there was the most variation across countries in the way they implemented frameworks for teacher evaluation. Practices ranged from very highly prescriptive national approaches that were very formal with quite bureaucratic procedures to be fulfilled, to informal approaches which are mostly left to the school level, and that was most common, the school leader being in charge of reviewing the teachers, but it would basically be their responsibility to see who and how often they would evaluate in their schools. It's a very controversial issue in many countries where this was being introduced. There was a lot of tension with teacher unions, with teachers going on strike, with teachers being very concerned about national approaches being introduced, and so there were a number of risks in terms of this actually hindering effective teaching practice where it was not implemented well. But in many countries that were participating in the study, there has been a renewed focus on teacher appraisal, as it has been recognized as a very important way to contribute to improved teaching and learning when this leads to professional development and to continuous learning of the teachers. So 29 systems had developed central standards that were trying to describe what is a good teacher and what should a good teacher know and be able to do. And most systems had policy frameworks for teacher appraisal in place. We distinguished 3 types of teacher appraisal. The first one was at the end of a probation or induction phase for teachers. The second one was continuous performance appraisal for continuous performance management, where teachers would be regularly reviewed and receive feedback, and this could feed, for example, into their career development and the development of further tasks that they should take on. And teacher appraisal systems that were explicitly focused for rewards, so really a bonus system. And we see that this last type was not very common at all, to have a teacher appraisal approach that is really just for rewards or sanctions. However, this is what is very much on teachers' minds. So in many countries this didn't exist, but there was a lot of anxiety about such a system being introduced and reducing the equality in teacher pay. What is most common is ongoing continuous performance management and appraisal for that purpose. In most countries, this is then linked to teacher professional development. So this is a graph from the OECD's Teaching and Learning International Survey, which is a survey of lower secondary education teachers across a number of countries. And we see that around 60% of lower secondary teachers in the TALIS countries agreed or strongly agreed that after their appraisal, a professional development plan would be implemented. And that's a very, very positive sign that appraisal is actually used to analyze teaching practice and to give some feedback that can be useful for a teacher's future learning. TALIS also asked teachers about their views and how far teacher appraisal is linked to career advancement. And this graph shows the percentage of teachers who reported a moderate or large positive change in the likelihood of career advancement after they received appraisal. And we see that this is less common than a link to teacher professional development. So on the average across TALIS countries, it was 36% of teachers who noticed such a link to career advancement. And we see that Israel is actually among the countries where more teachers report such a link to career advancement. Some of the main issues that came up in the analysis Well, one was what I already mentioned, that high-stakes teacher appraisal may lead to a climate of stress and anxiety. So it's really important to design teacher appraisal approaches in collaboration with the teacher professional organizations, and making sure that this is a process that is where there's common ownership and it's agreed upon as something that is useful for the profession, so that it can be useful for actual learning. In some countries, there was a lack of a very useful professional profile of standards to guide appraisal, and that sometimes hindered school leaders' practice in this area. Also, a great challenge was finding the right evidence and information to evaluate teachers. In some countries, we see over-reliance on just very few sources of information. So this may be just a very quick classroom observation once every 2 years is maybe not the best way to evaluate a teacher's competency. And also concerns around a simplistic use of student assessment results. Of course, using student assessment results can give a focus, can communicate the importance of teachers focusing on student outcomes and student learning. But if they use just the raw scores and as the only indicator, this raises a number of problems, in the sense that, of course, teachers are not the only ones contributing to students' learning. There are many other factors that we know that contribute to learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are also cumulative. It's not just the last teacher influencing those results. So some countries have tried to use value-added scores to evaluate teachers, but again, there are a number of methodological challenges in using this, and caution is needed, especially of not using this as the only indicator in a teacher evaluation system. We found that classroom observation, there's quite a bit of evidence that if it's done well, it's probably the best way to see and evaluate teaching practice and provide feedback, because this is where really teaching competencies are being displayed. However, in many countries there was insufficient guidance for school leaders to do this effectively. In many countries there are very strong traditions of teacher autonomy, and it's not that obvious for the school leader to go into classrooms and to evaluate teachers. So in some countries there was really a lack of legitimacy in the eyes of teachers for the school leader to be the ones who evaluates them. And also it was often based on quite obsolete checklists of just certain things to tick that teachers were doing in the classroom. So a lot of focus is now going into developing better tools for school leaders and also for peers and whole school leadership teams to develop skills to do classroom evaluations effectively, so that they can actually give constructive feedback based on those observation. And another challenge was around, in many countries, the absence of career opportunities for teachers. So often the only promotion opportunity for teacher would be to become a school leader, and in some countries there are such possibilities for vertical promotion following a teacher appraisal. However, this leads to a situation where the best teachers are actually moved out of the classroom as a reward for being good teachers. So countries are also looking to try and develop positions that are a promotion, but they allow teachers to stay in the classroom and to be expert teachers, or have specific focus, for example, mentoring of other teachers, but staying in the classroom oneself. Coming to school evaluation, we find across the participating countries an almost universal focus on national policies to stimulate school self-evaluation. So a focus on professionals developing the capacity to evaluate their own organization. There were only 4 countries, for those that we have information, where there were no requirements. Those were Greece, Italy, Mexico, and Spain. All other countries participating in the review had requirements for schools to undertake self-evaluation. Those requirements, however, vary a lot. In some countries it's producing a report, in others it's to account for student performance data, or specific other requirements of how the self-evaluation should be conducted. And countries also vary to the extent to which they actually provided comparative information back to school, which could help schools to benchmark themselves and to see how they were doing compared to a national understanding of quality that should be reached. Regarding external school evaluation, it is also established in the vast majority of OECD countries. Those that didn't have external inspections or evaluations were Finland, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, and Mexico, but all others had very clear requirements for external school evaluation. This is typically devised by central or state authorities and conducted by specific bodies such as the school inspectorate or a specific review body. So countries were very similar in the extent that they had requirements for self-evaluation and external evaluation. However, they vary to the extent to which they use the publication of school information as another tool for accountability and for evaluating the school. This is information that we have from PISA, which shows the percentage of students in schools where the principals reported that their school data was posted publicly. And we see a huge variation across countries. This is very, very common in the United States, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, but not so common at all in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Japan, Belgium, and Finland. So there's a huge variation. And of course, there are pros and cons to posting data publicly. It's important information that in some countries there's absolutely no question about posting that because it's a matter of transparency, and this type of data has to be disclosed. It gives information to parents about schools. But there was a lot of concern in almost all countries about the way that this influences school behavior. Because if there's a feeling that you're mostly evaluated on certain achievement scores, of course, as we discussed yesterday, there are incentives to try and make your school appear in the best light, and we have all those concerns related to teaching to the test, curriculum narrowing, drawing attention away from subjects that are not tested, and even outright gaming of the process. So countries try to the extent possible to place such information within a broader context and providing a wide range of information on schools and not just those test information. Some of the issues that came up through the analysis is in many countries a risk that compliancy dominates school evaluation. That is, that school evaluation actually became a quite bureaucratic paper-based process, where especially where we have very short external visits that are mostly based on documentation, while schools were very busy in the time preceding the evaluation preparing all those documents, but it wasn't a natural harvest of what they were doing anyways, and it wasn't something that was embedded in their regular practice or that was perceived as useful. So there's a focus on trying to shift the focus of school evaluation away from just being compliant with rules and regulations towards really a focus on school quality and on professionals being engaged in trying to improve practices, not just when the external evaluation is happening. In some countries, there was concern that there was actually a lack of agreed criteria of what is school quality and what does it mean to be a good school, to guide school evaluation. And the lack of such common criteria also led to the fact that self-evaluation and external evaluation were quite disjointed. And whereas there could be processes where there are synergies, where they play into each other, well, in some countries there were quite separate processes, and that wasn't very useful for schools. There's also challenges around building the capacity and promoting the engagement of all staff and students in school self-evaluation. So not making this a separate exercise for the management group of schools, but really integrating this into a professional organization where everybody is involved in the improvement process. Several countries were trying to better adapt external school evaluation to reflect the maturity of internal school evaluation cultures. So in some countries, for example, in New Zealand, we have this school evaluation approach where schools that are more advanced, that have very good self-review procedures, only get a quick external check every 4 or 5 years, whereas those that are more at risk of underperformance would be evaluated more frequently. The Netherlands also has such a risk-based approach where they focus mostly on the schools where they have information that there are problems, and the schools that they feel are thriving are not evaluated as often. And also concerns about ensuring systematic follow-up, providing support to those schools that turn out in the evaluation to be struggling. And there are also questions around who should provide this type of support. In some countries, it's actually the external review body or the inspectorate that would then help schools in their own development. But it creates challenges because then when the inspectorate comes back, they evaluate their own advice. So most countries are trying to have a separate body responsible for school support. And now coming to the last component of evaluation and assessment frameworks, the education system evaluation. We found that national educational measurements is quite well established in the majority of systems. So here we see systems that have student assessments for monitoring their students, full cohort or sample-based, and almost all countries have one or the other or both. Countries using surveys of students, teachers, and parents. This is also quite widespread, trying to understand the views of stakeholders in the system on how they experience the school climate and environment. And most countries are also now developing longitudinal information to track students over time. And I haven't spoken much about it, but also all OECD countries since the late 1990s are participating in international student assessments, and these also feed into national system monitoring. Regarding system evaluation, we found that there was a lot of focus in recent years on improving approaches to this, also in the context of calls to monitor performance in the public sector more broadly. So there's just a broader focus on evaluating policies, including education policies. We found, however, that many systems do not have an overall framework for education system evaluation, where ideally you would start from the national goals for the school systems, then you would map out what type of indicators you have to know whether those goals are being achieved, and plan for future indicator collection where there are gaps. We found that only a minority of countries actually did organize their system evaluation this way, where they mapped indicators against system priorities and planned to prioritize a new collection. Based on the information that we have, Israel does have such a system, but many countries had only one or the other, or neither of them. Some of the issues that came up in the analysis of system evaluation across countries were around the focus of national assessments. Most of them used multiple choice or closed format short answer tests, and there was not that much focus on having a broader curriculum coverage, using also performance tasks or oral elements, because this is also quite difficult and quite expensive to do on a national level. In those countries, for example, New Zealand, that have just a sample survey and that use those in cycles, so not every year, there's more room to develop more performance-based assessments, because you don't assess every student every year. And some countries were trying to integrate observation of students, interviews, and oral elements, performance tasks into those national assessments, but it's still quite rare. There were also concerns about capacity for evaluation up at sub-national levels. In many countries, we have the districts or municipalities or regional levels actually responsible for the evaluation of subsystems, and the competencies that those levels had varied a lot across countries, especially where we have very small municipalities in charge of evaluating their very small subsystem. And also concerns about, of course, again, making better use of results in planning and policy development. There's typically a lot of information, but not so much a strategic approach to organizing this information. And often political urgency comes into the play, where certain indicators at a certain time are becoming very important, as opposed to trying to establish a broad research base to evaluate the system over time. So this was just some information about the key trends that we observed across countries in the data that we collected from them. Now I would just briefly like to comment on those three main questions that I mentioned in the beginning, which were around the purpose and use of results, the scope and instruments for evaluation and assessment, and issues of governance and capacity. Regarding the purpose of evaluation and assessment, we found that most countries are using evaluation and assessment tools for both improvement and accountability purposes. And both of these are important. It's important to provide public information on how the education system is performing. And as Michal said yesterday, this is not going to go away. So this is part of evaluation and assessment systems. But we find challenges where really this accountability and especially high stakes focus becomes too prominent, or is intermixed in the same tool with a focus on also development and formative purposes. For example, some countries developed student assessments that were explicitly designed to providing feedback to schools, explicitly designed for formative use, and later on another purpose was added, which was also to monitor schools, which then of course added a high stake for schools. And then we see really that this accountability purpose comes in the way of formative use, and the test will not be used formatively anymore. There was also often a misunderstanding of the meaning of formative assessment or evaluation, which became more a type of summative assessment being done more often, or practice for a final summative assessment, rather than something that is really focused on the learning process, on uncovering learning as it is developing. We found the same issue in teacher appraisal approaches, where most countries have only one tool that is intended to support teacher professional development and also to hold teachers accountable. However, when you know that you're being held accountable based on those results, well, teachers will be less inclined to reveal any weaknesses, and this might make the improvement function much less powerful. I think all this points to the importance of being clear about purposes, and this is one of the key messages of the report, that an instrument that is designed for a specific purpose may not be the best tool to be used for another purpose. So it's important to set clear purposes for evaluation and assessment instruments, and also ensure that to build the trust that these are used in line with the original purpose. And some countries are making a lot of progress in mapping out for the system the range of tools that we have available for evaluation and assessment, and pointing to the designated purpose of each of them. So in New Zealand, for example, I'm sorry I'm mentioning New Zealand a lot because that was one of the countries that I went to, and that many countries were interested in the approaches. But they have an assessment resource map which maps out all the assessments, both those that are national and those that are available from private providers, and pointing to the possible uses and the things that you can do with them. So really having a map for schools, mapping out for them what are the different tools that you have. Another example of being clear about purposes was the teacher appraisal approach in Korea, where they had 3 different approaches. One was explicitly for professional learning, one was to influence the career, and that was much less frequent and that had more reliable instruments, and one was for specific rewards. So the purposes were clear, and the trust was built for the one that was really focused on professional development, that there was less anxiety for teachers of communicating the challenges and problems that they might have had. Being clear about purposes also involves aligning evaluation and assessment with student learning objectives. So to make clear that other elements of evaluation, such as teacher appraisal and school evaluation, also have as their final goal to focus on the student learning and to ensure that processes are being improved so that student objectives can be reached. So having the student learning really at the center of all of the framework. And of course, in this discussion about purposes, it's also important to consider potential unintended effects and to monitor how tools are being used in the system and may be misused in the system. Speaking around scope and process for evaluation and assessment, so this is very much about what is the type of learning that countries value, and how what are the best tools to try and assess this learning. So of course, across countries, there's focus on basic knowledge and skills. These are the building blocks for any other learning. So of course, basic knowledge and skills need to be assessed, and they're also more easily measurable. On the other hand, we find that most countries, or all countries, are much more ambitious in what they want their school systems to achieve. So we find an almost universal focus nowadays, at least in the rhetoric, on a 21st century learning, teaching and learning. So the idea is to develop broader skills in students that cut across subjects, that are things such as creativity, critical thinking, independent learning, learning to learn, teamwork, these kinds of things. And there's also a lot of research on 21st century approaches to teaching. So going beyond, of course, the teacher talking and the students listening, but having more interactive approaches. So there's a lot of research on effective teaching, and countries were struggling to integrate this knowledge that they had into the evaluation and assessment framework. So what we found is that often the instruments that existed really lagged behind the objectives that countries set for their systems. So there's a need to be more innovative in what is integrated in national policy frameworks for evaluation and assessment. And I think, as we heard yesterday, there is a lot of work going on. There are a lot of wonderful tools that exist, but they're not necessarily integrated on a broader level across the system. They often remain confined to smaller projects. So the report focuses quite a bit on different ways to go beyond simple measurement of basic knowledge and skills. It points to the importance of ensuring that all important aspects of teaching and learning are also given some attention in evaluation and assessment frameworks. It also points to the need to draw on multiple instruments and evaluators, so to have a comprehensive framework that look at different aspects of learning that we value, and the importance of exploring more the potential of ICT to facilitate innovative evaluation and assessment methods. And in trying to be innovative, of course, a very easy point to start is to look at what schools are actually doing, because here we have professionals in many schools who are actually already trying out many different approaches, and it's very important to actually listen to what they find useful in the classroom. So some countries are actually trying to build their evaluation and assessment frameworks building on practice-based expertise. And one example is Sweden, where they didn't have any approach to teacher appraisal. That was not something that they considered nationally. And they're now trying to build a teacher appraisal system based on a stock take of what is taking place across schools and based on the practices that they observe and that representatives of schools are finding useful. Another example maybe of going beyond measurement is in Finland, where they now have a focus on learning to learn skills across all subjects. So that's in the curriculum across all subjects. And then there's a national sample-based assessment trying to gauge the learning to learn skills that students have. And the final very important point is around governance and capacity. So how do we strike the balance between central external approaches to evaluation and assessment and more local school-based approaches, and who needs to be involved? As I said earlier, of course, it is the students themselves and the teachers and the school leaders who will actually be learning from evaluation and assessment evidence, and who are the ones who should use this information to improve practices. So having them involved as the primary people responsible for evaluation and assessment will generate ownership, professionalism in developing new approaches to this that are actually useful at the local level. But as I said earlier, we often notice a lot of variation across schools in the types of capacities that we have. And this leads to quite a lot of inequality in the type of learning that students can expect, in the types of expectations that schools have of their students in terms of learning. So central tools are vital to provide a common understanding of what do we consider quality, what are national expectations for learning, and what are some good approaches. So countries are trying to intermix these two, providing national tools, but allowing room for local adaptation, allowing room for local changes to those. So clearly evaluation and assessment is everyone's business. It's important to develop a shared vision for evaluation and assessment, and this implies involving professional organizations trying to build consensus, not imposing top-down a system that doesn't have, that isn't alive at the local level, to strengthen and build on teacher professionalism and focusing on the role of the learner, ensuring that students actually participate and are active in their own assessment. Having central reference points and tools, as I said earlier, for all these elements is really important. So things like learning progressions for students that teachers can use to develop criteria, having teacher standards, having common quality indicators for school evaluation. All of these contribute to making practices more effective, as long as they're a little bit flexible also in allowing for locally relevant criteria. And of course, building capacity is essential. So having more strategic approaches to professional learning. We find that evaluation and assessment is often quite fragmented across the initial teacher training and also professional development offers. And sometimes the school leaders' very important role is being forgotten in the framework. So school leaders do play a key role in evaluating their teachers and ensuring that they have assessment capacities in building capacity for school evaluation. So there are many ways in which we can provide better networks, better collaboration opportunities for school leaders. Some countries are also using school leaders to come on external review teams when schools are being externally evaluated. So they use their best school leaders and very experienced teachers to go on those teams. And this allows the external review team to have a perspective from the ground. And it also allows teachers and school leaders, as they go back to their school, to bring what they learned from other schools back into their environment. So overall, what the international report, I think, does is to advocate a balanced approach. I hope that came through across the presentation. Evaluation and assessment is complex and it's potentially very divisive. So these are very controversial issues in most of the countries that participated. And we do need to strike an intelligent balance between formative and summative approaches, between internal and external assessment, between central and local approaches. The report also highlights the importance of context, so you will not find in this book one-size-fits-all recommendations of what countries should do, but is much more a peer learning exercise that recognizes that different systems are at very different stages and have very different traditions in this area. So there's a need to start from where each country is, and then you can try and look what other countries are doing and learn from that. So the intention of this report is to provide a comprehensive analysis of trends and practices and policy developments across countries. And also the report tries to provide policy options to create synergies, so to really see all of this as a whole framework. And I feel I haven't talked about this enough, so I just have one slide about the potential synergies across evaluation and assessment frameworks. So typically student assessment results would need to feed into school and system evaluation, and countries need to think about how they should best feed into that so that the use of those results isn't detrimental. Teacher appraisal would typically be linked to professional development for individual teachers, but also should be more broadly linked to school development and to the priorities that each school sets itself for further development. Typically, the appraisal of school leaders, that I haven't talked much about, but there's a whole chapter on that in the report, would check the extent to which school leaders are implementing teacher appraisal approaches. So typically that remains a school-based practice, but it's important that there's an external check that this actually happens and some feedback on to school leaders on how they do it. School self-evaluation would typically include evaluation of learning and also of the assessment policy in the school, and also of staff appraisal and the development that feeds into. External school evaluation would check how schools conduct their internal self-evaluation, and external recommendations would also feed into further school development. At the system level, those results from external school evaluation, when they're aggregated, provide a picture of what happens across schools in the country. So we often have national thematic reports that are being published by the inspectorate, so external school evaluation bodies, and this provides a qualitative assessment of the school system as a whole. In turn, school information from system evaluation can be fed back to schools so that they have comparative information to benchmark themselves. And system evaluation should also feed back to adjust policies and refine measures. So what we see in practice is that these systems aren't designed as a whole system, but they have grown over time. It's something that has grown. Often the components have grown quite independently of each other. There are responsibilities that are spread across the system. So there's not typically a coherent thinking about that. But when countries start to engage into mapping out what they have and try to ensure that this fits into a coherent framework, this will help to avoid duplicated procedures and inconsistent objectives across the system. So some of the key principles in the report are around putting the learner at the center, enhancing teacher professionalism, fostering pedagogical leadership, moving from a focus on compliance to a focus on quality in school evaluation, and informing policies for system improvement, and trying to create links between all of those. So I hope the presentation managed to give you a flavor of the report. There's much more in it, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And all the materials that I mentioned are available on our website, so you can have a look if you're interested. Thank you very much for your attention.